All right. Well, so this morning we are continuing our worship series called, and we're using today the book of Esther. Now, we need to start off by spending a little bit of time talking about the book of Esther because it's a weird one. And it's not one that I assume many people are familiar with, other than maybe you've seen like the VeggieTales version, of the Esther story, which actually is a really good version. They did a good job. I can recommend it. But it's not a book that we go to a lot. It's not a book that tends to get read a lot, and there's a reason for it. Now, we tend today to kind of approach the Bible as a thing, right? Like, the Bible kind of is what it is and has been what it's been for a long time. And we can sometimes forget that there was different points throughout history where people had to decide what to include in the Bible and what not to include in the Bible. And Esther is actually one of those books, if you go back and kind of read the scholarship around it, Esther is one of those books that was kind of on the bubble several times about whether or not it gets included or not gets included. And there's a couple reasons for it. One is it sticks out because it's really more of like a novella. Right? I mean, it's this story of this woman and this man, and it's really written that way. It's written as a story. It's kind of like a novella story. There are parts that are very intentionally funny, apparently. That's one of those things where humor requires context. Like, I've read it before, and I've kind of snickered at it, and turns out I was supposed to, so that's good. But apparently, if you read it in the original Hebrew, it's hilarious. I'm not going to do that. But it has parts that are designed to be funny. Some of the characters are a little extreme. The king, for example, the king that Esther marries, is portrayed in this way where he's kind of a bit of a bumbling guy. It's interesting in that regard, and it's an interesting story for those reasons. The reason that sometimes it was debated about whether it actually belongs in the Bible is there's one thing that is actually never mentioned in the book of Esther, and it's the only book where this thing is not mentioned in the Bible. And that thing is God. Right. God is actually not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. And nor does anybody really pray or really engage in what we would kind of consider religious activity in the book. And even Esther herself, who we're told, is a Jew and is part of the Jews that are living outside of Israel, she doesn't really act like one. She doesn't follow the food laws. And of course, she gets married to somebody. She gets married to the king, somebody who is not a Jew. So the book, again, kind of stands out for this reason. So much so, and this bothered people so much so, that somewhere in the kind of 1st century BC, so about 100 years before Christ, somebody actually went and added 6 chapters to the book. And if you have like one of those big study Bibles that has the Apocrypha in it, those books that didn't quite make it, there's actually, you will find those additional chapters of Esther that add in a lot more like God and religion and all those sorts of things, because apparently it bothered people so badly that it wasn't there. Now, Esther is so why do we keep it around? Well, we keep it around because Esther is an important story. One is it helps us understand, and this is probably less relevant to us today, but at the time we kept it around because it helped people understand how the Jews lived when they lived outside of Israel. Most of the Bible is stories about the Jewish people, Old Testament. Most of the Old Testament is stories about the Jewish people in Israel itself. There aren't very many stories about people living outside of it. And after the Babylonian exile, there were actually a lot of people living outside of it. Not everybody went home. So it tells us an important story about that. So it's there for interesting for like historical purposes, kind of tells us what life was like for these folks. It's also an interesting story in terms of all of the different turnarounds that happen into it. Esther starts off as the lowliest of the low, really kind of a foreigner living in a foreign land, and through all kinds of, crazy shenanigans, ends up being the queen, right? So, it's this amazing arc that she has of somebody going from a very low position to a very high position. And of course, we love stories like that. that. We love, so-and-so makes good, kind of stories. Even though, total aside, if you haven't read it, you should read the first chapter about how and why they needed a new queen. It's funny. Okay. I'm going to leave you with that one. All right. All right. And so if you know anything about this book, if we know anything about the book, the passage you probably know is the one that we read. And it's this basic idea. The thing that kind of comes up a lot in Esther is this idea of, somebody being somewhere for such a time as this, right? So if you ever heard that phrase, like, I am here, you are here, we are here for such a time as this, right? That comes from Esther, right? And so what Mordecai is trying to say is it feels kind of erratic, it feels kind of random that you ended up queen. There's no real reason for it up until this point, but maybe now we have found the reason for it, right? I think we all can recognize those times in our lives, right, where something happens and we're not sure why, or we're not sure there's a purpose to it, and then only later do we discover why that thing was important or what happened. So that's usually what we know this book for, is that idea that, all this stuff that happened up to that point, maybe this is one of the reasons why, or the purpose you will find in it is now you can go and do this. Now the problem is that the king's basically second in command has decided that he doesn't like the Jews anymore, and he basically tricked the king into issuing an order that would basically exterminate all of them in the country. So that's the problem that they are facing. And so Mordecai is reminding Esther, hey, by the way, you're one of us. No, the king doesn't know that, but do you think he's not going to find out? And what happens when he finds out? You're not going to be any safer where you are than any of the rest of us are. But none of the rest of us have access to the king to go to see if he can do something about this thing that he's going to let happen. So it really is a life and death situation that Esther is in, both for herself and for her people. And what she's being asked to do in and of itself, as we read this morning, is also a life and death situation, because she's being asked to do something she ought not do, and she knows that. So this little scene that we have here, there's this little back and forth between the messengers with Esther and Mordecai, who's kind of like this uncle figure in the book. And Mordecai needs to convince her to go, so he gives her a reason. Maybe this is why you were here. And before Esther agrees to go, she asks him to do something for him. She says, go and gather all of the Jews, and yourself included, in this city, and you fast for me for 3 days, and I will fast for 3 days, and then I will go. And I think this moment is a little easy to overlook, but we really shouldn't. Because really what is happening there is Esther is going to Mordecai and basically saying, yes, I am part of your group, and we are together, and we are a group together, and yes, I'm the one that has to go, and when I go, I will be by myself. But if we do this thing together, if we do this fast together first, then I will not feel like I'm going on my own. I will know that I am going in many ways with you two, that you are there, that you are supporting me. And even sometimes just that feeling, even just knowing that others, even if it is something that we do have to do ourselves and only we can do it, just even knowing that there's other people around us thinking about us, praying for us, fasting for us, supporting us, thinking about us, whatever it is, whatever that thing is that we're facing, somehow feels a little easier, right? I think hopefully most of us have had this experience sometimes in our life when we're facing a challenge and we've reached out to folks and say, hey, could you pray for me? I don't know how many times I see on Facebook. It's like, I would welcome your prayers and good vibes. I don't know where good vibes came from, but that's like, I guess that's prayers from non-praying type people. I don't know. But, I would appreciate your prayers and good vibes for XYZ happening in my life. And it's something we do put out in the world because we know, even though they may not be physically with us, the idea that people are supporting us in that way, thinking about us, carrying us in that way, means something to us, even if they aren't there with us. Because the reality is human beings don't do very well all on their own. Human beings, as my wife likes to say, are pack animals, right? or maybe herd animals. I don't know. Well, Jesus did call us sheep a lot. Because we will do what we have to find ways to be together and support each other. Now, if you are of a certain age, you are aware that during the for many years during teenage years, a standard activity amongst teenagers was to basically get in your car and drive up and down a street, right? We called it dragging Maine back in eastern Montana, or I was. Most times they called it cruising, right? I mean, and so most of you young people don't know anything about this, and I'm sorry for you. You've missed out. But this was a standard Friday night activity. If you wanted to find most of the high school, you would find them in their cars driving up and down Main Street. And there was always talk that they were going to try to ban it or get rid of it. And so a lot of towns did ban it and get rid of it. And they said they decided it was a bad thing or whatever. But this is a tradition that's dated back for decades. Whoever cruised, Main Street or whatever in your local town? I'm not the only one. Yeah, exactly. And no young people. Okay. And so it's the thing that you did. And the thing that I noticed, I was thinking about this a couple of years ago, the thing that I noticed was any place anybody ever went and did this, any kind of like cruising place that you did, if you notice, they always had one thing in common, which is they always doubled back on each other, right? You never did a big circle, right? You went up and then you went back down, and then you went up and then you went back down, right? And it took me, I don't know why I didn't realize this at the time. It took me years later to realize why we did that. I'm like, oh, that's so you could see everybody else who was out, right? You only had to do that a couple of times, and then you saw and passed everybody else who was doing it too. And what would you do if you saw somebody you knew or saw your friends? You'd flag them down, right? You'd wave at them. You'd go say, hey, let's go park in the gas station parking lot. You get together or whatever. And looking back on it now, I realize what we were doing that I didn't realize we were doing at the time is we were basically organizing ourselves, right? There was this unwritten rule we all knew. We all showed up here. We all drove laps until we found the people we wanted to find, right? And then we formed an even bigger pack, and then we went off to do whatever it is we were going to do that night, go to the McDonald's or whatever it is you do in eastern Montana, which is not much. Well, you don't even have a mall, but I do think in some places, in some communities, if you have things like malls and stuff like that, that kind of replaces this phenomenon. You just know everybody shows up at the mall at 7 o'clock at the food court. We didn't have a mall. It was 2 hours away because eastern Montana. So instead we had this. And so I think this is a big, small town thing. Now, I joke because I don't know that this happens anymore. It definitely doesn't happen back home because my wife and I were there on a Friday night and we're like, where is everybody? And we're like, and we asked about dragging Maine and they're like, nobody does that anymore. I'm like, really? And I'm like, why not? And it's like, oh. And it took me a while to realize why not. Something killed it. Text messages. Grouped text messaging kill dragging Maine because now you don't need to. You can just send a message out into the world. You say, hey, what do you want to do? Da, 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 da. So all of that organizing that we were doing, burning gas, driving up and down, all that organizing we were doing with itself has now been replaced with text messaging. It's been replaced with other ways that people can now organize sort of ad hoc activities, on a random night of the week. And it's gotten really, really efficient at it. And that's sort of the thing about human beings. This is how much we desire, this is how much we need to be with each other. This is how much we want to see and spend time with other people, is that we will make up stupid things, like driving up and down a street, burning gas at $1.60 a gallon back then, in order to, whatever. You guys had it easy. Yeah. All right. But we would do this because we needed to be together so much. We needed to be with each other so much. And so when new technology comes out, one of the first things we do with new technology is find ways to organize ourselves with it. We find ways, like with the text messaging and the Twitter and everything else, to find ways to create places for us to be together. It's one of those things, one of those interesting things. There was a couple of things that were predicted early on in like the computer revolution and the internet revolution. One was that paper would go away because we would all just email things to each other. That's actually not true. We print more today than we ever have printed in our lives. It's a great time to be in the paper business. And two, there was afraid that we would actually stop meeting in person as much, or stop meeting together as much. And while that has shifted and changed, when they do the studies now, they realize that we actually don't. Instead of the technology replacing gathering together, the technology facilitates us gathering together in a way that we couldn't do before. Now, this isn't new. This isn't new. It dates back to Esther, but it also dates back. It's actually the founding principle. The founding principle of the Methodist movement was this. When John Wesley and his brother Charles got together with that first group of people, what they organized them into first were small groups of people who were supposed to do life together. And they called these things class meetings. We talked about those before. They also had band meetings, which were even more serious groups of people. And there was not only an expectation in the early church, in the early Methodist movement, there was not only an expectation that you would be part of these things, that you would gather with other people. It was a requirement to do it if you wanted to stay in the society. And so every class leader would give you, at the end of every quarter, your quarterly ticket. I want to give tickets. I think that would be fun, right? And the quarterly ticket said you came, and you came regularly, and if you had the quarterly ticket, you'll love this. If you had the quarterly ticket, you could go to the quarterly church services. And if you didn't have your ticket, you couldn't go to church, and you had to go on a program where you basically had to get rehabbed back into like, all right, well, you got to show up for the next quarter. That's how awesome our quarterly church meetings were, is you had to have a ticket to get in. I don't think we'll bring that back. Maybe not. I don't know. And this is something that actually came to the United States and was doing for a long time. Actually, it's only been the last 100 years or so that the Methodist Church's rules changed that said you no longer, had to participate in these class meetings. And of course, part of that is because the world changed. And how people gathered in the 1700s isn't how people gather today, right? So the means, what we did as Methodists, what those meetings look like and how they functioned, really wouldn't work today. There's been lots of attempts to bring them back and, all this sort of stuff, and very rarely do they work out because we just live in a different time, in a different place now than we lived 300 years ago. But the need that we have, together, the need that we have to be together, the need to have to do something together is still there, and it's still in us. And I think that's why. I mean, I know we're at this place now where we've got, in our church, we've got people who gather here in person, we've got the folks who gather online. One thing I find interesting and actually kind of love is if you're watching the service online, you can pretty much do it anytime you want to do it. Right? But people don't. Most everyone who gathers with us at 9:30, right? You all know that out there in camera land. You're there. But, they gather with us at 9:30 to do this thing with us, right? So even if you're gathering, because we have people gathering from, I think, about 7 different states right now. So they're always going to, be in that boat. But it's interesting that people are still there because it's still important, even if we're not in body together, that we gather together at this time and be in spirit with each other. But the truth is, it doesn't really even matter if you even do it at the same time the rest of us do it. By being here and claiming us and being part of us, and allowing us to claim you and be part of you, we are together in spirit, whether we are together in person or in whatever way we are together. Because for Esther, who knew she was going to be standing alone, also knew that if she was going to do that, she needed to feel like she wasn't standing alone. So they did something, even though they were separated from each other, and even though many of the people that were no doubt praying and fasting with her, she never met. and had no idea who they were or what their names were, the fact that they were together and did something together and had that experience together, Esther could walk into that room confident that she was not alone. She was not alone in spirit. There were people, many people with her. The truth is, a lot of us have people in our lives. A lot of us have people in our lives that are the people that we go to when we need to not feel alone. They're the people we reach out to when things get hard, or we're not sure what's going on, or our anxiety is flaring. It's the people we know we can just vent to, and they're going to reply back, yeah, man, that stinks. The people who will listen to us, the people we will send us prayers or good vibes when we ask for them. And those people are a blessing. So we're going to do something here in a minute. I want you to think. I want you to think of somebody that you know in your life who is like that for you. Think of somebody in your life who was like your Mordecai, the one that you can reach out to and say, hey, I'm going through some stuff. Can you send some good feelings my way? Or can we get together and have a coffee? Think about who that person is. And now, because this is how we do everything, I'm going to invite you to, if you have it, get out your phone. And I want you to send that person a text message right now. I want you to send him a message saying something along the lines of, thank you. Thank you for always being there for me. Thank you for being a good friend. I'm just thinking about you, and I wanted you to know. Whatever it is you want to say that will help that person, them know that they are loved and cared for by you. If you don't have a phone, you're not a text type, feel free to write yourself a note. Maybe you can send them a note later on. But I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about that person. Think about the message you want to send them. I realize some of you might be actually sitting next to the people you wanted to text. So I saw some hugging over here, which is great. I think I actually saw some tech support happening back here. That's nice. We're in it together, people. So this is one of the things that we recognize. What does God want from us? The whole idea of this whole series is, what does God want from us? Well, God wants us to remember that faith, and in fact, not just faith, but life is a team sport. If you go back to the book of Genesis, you will see that in the Garden of Eden at the beginning there was only one problem, and the problem was Adam was alone. And that problem was solved when he was given a companion. Because human beings just don't do very well all by ourselves. Thankfully, the promise that we have is that we are never all by ourselves. We are never completely alone. For one thing, God is always with us. God was with Esther, even though God doesn't even get a mention in the book. And God's with us when we're going through hard stuff and when we're going through happy stuff. And if you are here, however you are here, with us in person or online or whatever it is, then you are part of a community and you're on a team. You're on this team, whether you want to be or not. And I'm grateful you're on this team. And if you're on this team, then if you look around with everybody else on your team, you're loved by those people, even if you don't like them. Because that's how this works. So I think at the end of the day, the most miraculous thing that we actually see in Esther is in that scene where she says, I'm going to fast, you fast with me. And I think the miracle in that scene was she asked for help. She didn't want to feel alone, and so she reached out to people that she both knew and didn't know and said, will you help me? Will you do this with me so that I do not feel like I'm all by myself? I think oftentimes for us, that's actually the hardest part. The actual hardest part in all of it is actually reaching out to people and taking that time and taking that initiative and saying, hey, there's some stuff going on. Can we get some coffee? Can I buy you lunch? Can we go for a walk? Too many of us, I think, are just have this weird need. We're like, no, I'm just going to take care of it all by myself. We don't need to take care of things all by ourselves. We're on a team. We're on the team that God put us on so that we don't have to do things by ourselves. So whether it's driving up and down the street looking for your friends, or sending the text message, or putting something out on Facebook asking for, good prayers and good vibes, whatever it is, let us follow the example of Esther, because we are called to play for the team. We are called to be on each other's team. We're called to ask for help when we need it, and we're called to give help when we are asked. Amen.